Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. One thing that's been on my mind is how religion and conflict seem to be intertwined.
Yeah, it's like this age-old story, Religion's supposed to be about peace, but it ends up being a flashpoint for so much tension and violence.
Exactly, like we saw with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict this year. It just seems like a never-ending cycle. And I'm really curious to understand how different faiths view things like revenge forgiveness.
Yeah, the whole ethical battleground, right?
Yeah, so we've got some fascinating sources to dig into today. Articles about the conflict itself, excerpts from religious texts like the Bible and the Qur'an, and even reports on how the media shapes our understanding of these events.
It's going to be a deep dive for sure. So much to unpack.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. It feels like every year the conflict in the Middle East gets more complicated. 2024 was definitely no exception.
Yeah, no kidding. And to really grasp what's going on, I think we need to understand how different religious traditions view conflict itself. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, how do they each approach ideas of retaliation and forgiveness?
Okay, so let's start with Christianity. A lot of people associate it with turning the other cheek and pacifism.
Right. Love your enemies, all that.
But then we see a long history of Christian nations engaging in warfare. How do we reconcile those two things?
Yeah, it's a good question. It gets to the heart of how religious ideals actually play out in the real world. The New Testament, especially Jesus's teachings, lay out this radical vision of love and forgiveness.
Yeah, like the turn the other cheek stuff.
Exactly. But applying that to geopolitics, to situations where national security is on the line, that's a whole different ballgame.
And within Christian thought, there's this whole concept of a just war, trying to find that balance between pacifism and self-defense.
Right. It's an attempt to define ethical boundaries for warfare, saying when it's morally okay to fight. But the problem is, those criteria are open to interpretation. Different groups use them to justify their own actions, even when those actions seem to contradict the core message of love and forgiveness.
So even within Christianity, there's a whole spectrum of beliefs when it comes to violence and conflict. It's not as black and white as some people might think.
Not at all.
Okay, what about Judaism? How does that tradition approach these issues?
Well, Judaism often gets this reputation, especially from people who aren't familiar with it, for being all about an eye for an eye.
Right, that whole revenge thing.
Yeah. But that phrase from the Torah is often misunderstood. The original intention wasn't to promote endless retaliation. It was about proportional justice.
Interesting. So more like setting limits on vengeance?
Exactly. To prevent excessive punishment, it was radical for its time, promoting restraint in a world where tribal warfare was brutal. And the Torah also emphasizes compassion, forgiveness, reconciliation within the community.
So it's more nuanced than just an eye for an eye.
Way more. But the challenge is applying these ancient principles to the modern state of Israel, a secular nation, but with a deep Jewish identity. And then you layer on the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right, so you have these ancient teachings, the realities of nation states, and this incredibly volatile region. How does that all play out within Jewish thought?
Oh, it's a constant debate. Within different Jewish communities, some interpret the Torah's emphasis on protecting the Jewish people as justification for a strong military approach,
Makes sense.
while others really emphasize peace and reconciliation even with their enemies.
It's like this struggle between pragmatism and idealism. How do you balance these ancient values with the realities of such a tough region? And then you throw in the media.
Oh, absolutely. The media often presents a very polarized view of the conflict,
It's all about violence and retaliation.
Yeah, and they kind of neglect the voices calling for peace and understanding.
It's easy to get caught up in those images and stories, especially with social media and the 24/7 news cycle.
Right. And actually, one of our sources highlighted this organization called NEXUS-I.
NEXUS-IBA?
Yeah, they're trying to counter those dominant narratives.
Interesting. How so?
They broadcast balanced and impartial news coverage directly into the conflict zone.
Wow. So they're trying to cut through all the noise and provide a more nuanced perspective.
Exactly, especially to those who are most affected by the conflict. And they focus on amplifying the voices of people on both sides who are working towards peace. The ones rejecting the cycle of violence.
That's so important, especially when you think about how media narratives can shape public opinion, even political decisions.
For sure. It's a reminder that words matter. Stories have power.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about Christianity and Judaism.
Yeah.
Let's move on to Islam. Like Christianity, Islam also emphasizes forgiveness and mercy.
Right, definitely.
But I remember from our source material that the Qur'an also acknowledges the human instinct for revenge. and allows for self-defense in certain situations.
You got it. The Quran condemns aggression and injustice,
Mm-hmm.
but it recognizes that people have a right to defend themselves when attacked.
Okay.
However, any retaliation must be proportional.
Interesting.
It should never exceed the harm that was inflicted. And forgiveness, even for your enemies, is always considered the higher moral path.
So there's this tension between acknowledging that desire for revenge, but promoting forgiveness as the ultimate goal.
Right.
How does that tension play out in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
That's where things get really tricky. Different interpretations within Islam come into play. Some groups like Hamas draw upon the concept of jihad to justify armed resistance against what they see as Israeli oppression.
And jihad, of course, is a term that's often misinterpreted in the West.
Yeah, it's often portrayed as like a holy war, but it's much more nuanced than that. Jihad literally means struggle, and it encompasses a wide range of meanings.
So it's not inherently about violence or conquest?
No, not at all. But in the context of this conflict, certain groups interpret jihad as a justification for armed resistance against Israel.
Oh, see.
They often cite the Qur'an's verses on self-defense, but even within those groups, there's debate about what constitutes legitimate self-defense and what crosses the line into terrorism. What violates Islamic principles.
It seems like there's this constant struggle within these religious traditions, trying to reconcile these ancient texts with modern complexities.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that we're talking about billions of people across the globe who adhere to these faiths. So to paint them all with the same brush is to ignore the incredible diversity of thought and interpretation within each religious community.
It's a good reminder that religion is a lived experience, shaped by personal interpretations, cultural contexts, individual experiences. And then you add in the geopolitics of the Middle East.
Exactly. It becomes even more layered and complex.
Right. And as we look ahead to 2025, understanding those religious dimensions of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is going to be crucial in finding a path forward.
It's at the heart of it all, really.
Because achieving a lasting peace will require more than just political agreements. It demands a deeper understanding of the beliefs that shape how each side views the conflict, their enemies, and themselves. It's a lot to wrap your head around. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, all these different perspectives on revenge, violence, forgiveness.
Yeah, and then they're all playing out in this incredibly complex conflict.
Yeah. No easy answers here, that's for sure.
So after this deep dive, what are your thoughts? Is there any path forward that honors those religious principles, but also acknowledges all the pain and mistrust on both sides?
It's the question, right? The one that's been hanging over this region for so long.
Yeah.
And, while there are no simple solutions, our sources did point to some potential starting points.
Okay, so what are they? Where do we even begin to bridge this divide, especially when religion seems to be both inspiring conflict and offering solutions to it?
Well, I think one key step is recognizing the power of dialogue. Truly listening to and understanding the other side's perspective. That sounds great in theory, but in practice, it seems like every attempt at dialogue just falls apart. Everyone's just pointing fingers and blaming each other.
Yeah, it's tough, for sure. But one of our sources talked about this really interesting initiative.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
It's a group of Israeli and Palestinian religious leaders. They've been meeting secretly for months now.
Secretly?
Yeah. Engaging in interfaith dialogue based on shared scriptural teachings.
Wow. That's pretty brave, considering the political climate. They could face a lot of backlash.
For sure. But their goal is to build understanding and empathy.
Yeah.
Focusing on the common ground between their faiths.
Interesting. What kind of things are they talking about?
They're exploring passages from the Bible, the Torah, the Qur'an, all emphasizing peace, forgiveness, compassion.
Wow.
They're reminding each other that despite their differences, they share a common humanity and a belief in a God who calls them to love their neighbors.
It's amazing that they're finding that common ground amid so much division. But can religious teachings really translate into real change on the ground? Can they actually influence the politics of the conflict?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's too early to say what impact these dialogues will have, but they represent a glimmer of hope, Even in these really dark times, there are people who refuse to give up on peace.
It's inspiring to hear about these efforts.
Yeah.
It makes you think about the role we all play in shaping a more peaceful future. It can feel so overwhelming when you look at the scale of these conflicts. But what can we do as individuals to make a difference?
Well, one of the most powerful things we can do is challenge our own biases and assumptions.
Our own biases?
Yeah. Educate ourselves about the complexities of these issues. Engage in respectful dialogue with people who hold different viewpoints.
It's easy to fall into those simplistic narratives. The us versus them mentality that you see so often in the media and on social media.
Absolutely. We need to be more critical of the information we consume, seek out diverse perspectives, and resist that urge to demonize the other side.
Because ultimately, we all have a part to play in creating a more peaceful world.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, if we can cultivate that spirit of understanding and empathy in our own lives, it'll ripple outwards, you know?
It's a chain reaction.
Yeah. And eventually lead to a world where peace is more than just a dream. It becomes a reality.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive into religion and conflict, we leave you with this question. How can you, in your own unique way, become an agent of peace and understanding in a world that so desperately needs it?
It's a question worth pondering for sure.
It is. It's a challenge worth embracing, a journey worth taking, because the future of humanity might just depend on our collective willingness to choose love over hate, forgiveness over revenge, dialogue over division. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.